Survival in London, high society didn't require beauty. It required obedience. For a woman with a substantial dowry, a pretty face was just the ribbon on the snare. Aurora understood the brutal math of the marriage mart by the time she was 18. To avoid being sold to the highest, most titled bidder, she didn't need to run away. She just had to make herself entirely unmarketable. She spent 3 years perfecting the art of being deeply, profoundly repulsive. And it worked, until the Duke of Ashbourne looked twice. The ballroom of the Earl of Hemsley smelled of melting beeswax, sour sweat, and the cloying lavender water elderly matrons used to mask the heat. It was the height of the 1814 season, and the room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful, desperate people in England. Aurora Holling stood near the potted palms, perfectly camouflaged against the velvet curtains. That was by design. "Stand up, Aurora, for God's sake!" her mother hissed, not bothering to turn her head. Lady Halling maintained a fixed, terrifying smile aimed at the dance floor. Her fingers, however, found the flesh of Aurora's upper arm and pinched hard. "You look like a crumpled napkin." Aurora didn't flinch. She simply slouched further, rounding her shoulders until her collarbones disappeared into the high, suffocating neckline of her gown. The gown itself was a masterpiece of sabotage. While the other debutantes wore sheer muslins in ivory petal pink and ice blue, Aurora had commissioned a dress in a heavy, stiff bombazine. The color was a sickly, oxidized mustard. It was a shade that instantly drained the blood from her complexion, making her skin look chalky and jaundiced. She'd gone further. Her maid, bribed heavily with Aurora's pin money, had pulled her dark hair back with vicious severity, scraping it flat against her skull and knotting it into a heavy, unbalanced lump at the nape of her neck. The style pulled the skin of her forehead tight, giving her a permanent, dull-witted squint. She wore no powder. She wore no rouge. She had spent the last hour of her afternoon reading in dim light to ensure the faint bruised shadows under her eyes were prominent. She looked exhausted, sickly, and utterly devoid of charm. A young baron drifted past their corner. His eyes swept over Lady Halling, flicked to Aurora, and immediately glazed over. He didn't even pause his stride, altering his trajectory toward a gaggle of laughing girls in white silk across the room. Lady Halling exhaled a shaky, furious breath. 3 seasons. 3 seasons, Aurora, and you have not secured a single proposal, not even a dance from anyone above the rank of an unlanded vicar. "I am sure it is just a slow evening, Mother," Aurora said. She pitched her voice low and flat, stripping it of any musicality. She sounded like a door dragging over gravel. "It is not a slow evening. You are simply—" Her mother stopped, swallowing the word. Ugly. She couldn't say it. It was too great a defeat. Aurora felt a familiar, cold spike of triumph. It was cruel to disappoint her mother. She knew that. But the alternative was unthinkable. Aurora had watched her older sister, a great beauty, married off to a viscount who drank his way through her dowry and left her with a swollen belly and a black eye twice a year. High society was an abattoir with better lighting. The men here didn't want partners. They wanted broodmares, bank ledgers, and ornamental vases. By making herself the ugliest vase in the shop, Aurora ensured she was left on the shelf. In 2 more years, she would be officially declared a spinster. She would gain control of her trust, retire to a small cottage in Kent, and read books in the sun until she died. It was a brilliant, flawless plan. Across the room, the crowd parted. The shift in the room's energy was palpable, the low murmur of conversation suddenly pitching higher, growing frantic. Caelan Pendleton, the Duke of Ashbourne, had arrived. Aurora watched him from the safety of her mustard-colored armor. Ashbourne was not the handsome, rakish sort of duke that populated the penny dreadfuls her maid read. He was tall, heavily built, and moved with a grim, deliberate energy, like a man walking through deep mud. He had spent the last 5 years in the north, dragging his heavily indebted estates out of the ruin his father had left behind. He had coal dust in his pedigree and a reputation for being ruthlessly pragmatic. He needed a wife. The Tun knew this. He needed an heir, and he needed a woman who wouldn't spend his newly stabilized fortune on French lace and gambling debts. The mothers of Mayfair converged on him like sharks smelling blood in the water. Aurora watched as Kaylin was introduced to Miss Clara, a girl often likened to a porcelain doll. Clara fluttered her eyelashes. She dropped her fan. It was a practiced, desperate routine. Kaylin looked at the fan on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He looked at Clara, his expression completely blank, muttered a brief perfunctory greeting, and walked away. Clara's smile shattered. Aurora let out a short, blunt snort of amusement. She caught herself instantly, clapping a hand over her mouth. She snapped her posture back into its rigid slump, pulling her chin down to create the illusion of a double neck. But it was too late. Across the heads of 50 aristocrats, Callan's gaze had snapped to the corner. He had heard the laugh. It wasn't a polite giggle. It was a bark of genuine cynical humor. His eyes locked onto the hideous mustard gown. They tracked up to the severe, punishing hairstyle. They rested on Aurora's face. Aurora held her breath. She let her eyes go dull and slightly crossed, her jaw hanging slack by a fraction of an inch. "Look away," she willed him. "I am nothing. I am the wallpaper." Kaylin stared for 3 long seconds. His expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't grimace. Then he turned away, disappearing into the crowd toward the card rooms. Aurora exhaled slowly, her chest tight beneath the stiff fabric, a narrow escape. She adjusted her shoulders, sinking deeper into her slouch. The hunt moved on. She was safe. 3 nights later, the battlefield shifted to Lord Carmichael's estate. It was a grander affair, spilling out of the house and into the vast, manicured gardens. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of crushed grass. Aurora's feet were bleeding. She had deliberately requested her shoemaker craft her slippers a half size too small, with a rigid instep. The pain forced a heavy, ungraceful limp into her walk, destroying whatever natural elegance she possessed. By midnight, the charade was taking a physical toll she could barely endure. Her mother was engaged in a vicious, whispered argument with a dowager countess over a plate of dried figs. Seizing the opening, Aurora slipped backward, blending into the shadows of the hallway, and limped her way toward the one sanctuary in every grand house, the library. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the screech of the string quartet. The room was vast, lined with mahogany shelves and smelling of old leather, dust, and quiet. Aurora let out a long, ragged sigh. She limped to the nearest heavy leather armchair, dropped into it, and kicked off her agonizing shoes. She groaned aloud, rubbing the angry red marks on her arches. Then she stood up. Alone in the dark, the disguise fell away. It was a physical uncoiling. Aurora pushed her shoulders back, her spine straightening with a series of quiet pops. She lifted her chin, stretching the cramped muscles of her neck. She raised her hands to her head, pulling out 3 strategically placed pins that held the excruciating tension at her temples. The heavy knot of hair loosened, framing her face in softer, darker waves. She walked to the large bay window. Stripped of the slouch, the limp, and the manufactured clumsiness, she moved with fluid grace. The moonlight caught her profile as she looked out over the gardens. She wasn't a porcelain doll like Clara. Her features were strong, a sharp jaw, a straight aristocratic nose, and eyes that were alert and deeply intelligent. She took a deep breath, savoring the rare sensation of just being a human being in her own body. She reached out, pulling a heavy volume from the nearest shelf, a treatise on crop rotation. She opened it, leaning against the window frame, completely absorbed. Fascinating reading for a ball. The voice came from the deep shadows near the fireplace. It was low, gravelly, and entirely male. Aurora dropped the book. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Instinct took over before conscious thought. Her shoulders collapsed inward, her neck shortened, her face contorted into an expression of dim, panicked confusion. She dragged her bare right foot inward, recreating the awkward pigeon-toed stance. Kalen Pendleton stepped out of the gloom. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, his cravat slightly loosened. He had clearly been hiding in here long before she arrived. I was just Aurora stammered, raising her voice to the grating, nasal pitch she used in public. The pictures. I was looking at the pictures. Kylan looked down at the book on the floor. There are no pictures in an agricultural treatise on the nitrogen cycle of soil, Miss Halling. He knew her name. The realization sent a cold spike of genuine panic through her chest. Dukes did not learn the names of the ugly, ignored girls in the corners. Kylan took a slow step forward. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her overall shape. "You lost your limp," he said quietly. "I rested my foot," she lied, her voice whining softly. She looked down, playing the part of the intimidated, dull-witted spinster. "It is better now." "I see." Kylan took another step. He was close enough now that she could smell the brandy on his breath, mixed with soap and clean linen. "And your spine? Did it miraculously heal as well?" Aurora froze. "I watched you walk in, Miss Halling," Kylan said, his voice stripped of polite society pretense. It was the voice of a man who balanced ledgers and calculated margins. "You walked like a woman with a stone in her shoe and a yoke across her neck, and then the door closed." He paused, tilting his head. His eyes were dark, piercing, and completely devoid of pity. "You grew 3 inches. The asymmetry in your shoulders vanished. The heavy, dragging step disappeared." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have bought hundreds of horses, Miss Halling. I know how to look at bone structure beneath a bad coat. Your posture is a deliberate fabrication." "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," Aurora mumbled, staring stubbornly at his boots. She forced her bottom lip to protrude slightly. I am tired." "You are a fraud," Kylan corrected calmly. He didn't sound angry. He sounded fascinated. Aurora kept her head down. She couldn't look at him. If she looked at him, he would see the sharp, calculating terror in her eyes, and the game would be over entirely. "You should put your shoes back on," Kylan said, turning toward the door. "The floors are drafty, and when you walk back out there, remember to favor your left foot. You were limping on the right earlier. Consistency is key to a good lie." The door opened and closed. Aurora stood trembling in the moonlight, her meticulously crafted armor cracked straight down the middle. The following Tuesday brought a musical at the Duchess of Richmond's townhouse. It was a suffocatingly formal event. Rows of gilded chairs were lined up facing a harpsichord, forcing the attendees into close, unavoidable proximity. Aurora had doubled down. She wore a gown of bruised plum taffeta that rustled aggressively with every movement. She had applied a fine layer of grayish powder to her face to look slightly ill. She took her seat at the very back of the room, near the doors, hoping to sleep through the impending soprano performance with her eyes open. A heavy weight settled into the fragile, gilded chair beside her. Aurora didn't have to look. She recognized the scent of clean linen and the sheer physical mass of the man. Her mother, seated to her left, let out a tiny, strangled gasp. Lady Halling's eyes bulged as she looked past Aurora to the Duke of Ashbourne, who was calmly arranging his long legs in the cramped space. "Your Grace," Lady Halling whispered frantically, trying to lean across Aurora. "This seat. We were saving it for my husband." "Lord Halling is currently in the card room losing heavily at whist, ma'am," Kylan said, not looking at her. He stared straight ahead at the harpsichord. "I doubt he will mind." Lady Halling snapped her mouth shut, her mind visibly racing with the impossibility of the situation. Why was the Duke sitting next to her hideous daughter? Aurora stared straight ahead. She slouched her spine so severely she felt a cramp seize her lower back. She breathed loudly through her nose. The music began. A young woman in pink began to wail a tragic Italian aria. "The taffeta is a nice touch," Kylan whispered. His voice barely carried over the music, pitched perfectly for her ear alone. "It draws attention to the fact that you have no waist in that cut. Did you design it yourself, or is your seamstress legally blind?" Aurora didn't react. She let her jaw hang slack. "I checked the registry," Kylan continued, shifting his weight. His shoulder brushed against hers. It was like leaning against a brick wall. "You're 21. Your dowry is 30,000 pounds. A considerable sum. Unencumbered land in Surrey." Aurora's hands tightened in her lap. He had looked up her financial records. A woman with 30,000 pounds could look like a rotting corpse and still have suitors lining up in the rain, Kaelin murmured. Yet you have not had a single caller in 3 years. Your mother's despair is the talk of the matrons. I am unlucky, Aurora whispered back, pitching her voice into its most grating nasal tone. You are a tactician, Kaelin countered. The soprano hit a high note that rattled the crystal chandeliers. Why? Kaelin asked. It wasn't a demand. It was a genuine inquiry. Why go to such excruciating lengths to make yourself a pariah? Aurora turned her head to look at him. She kept the squint. She kept the slack jaw. I do not understand you, Your Grace. I am simply plain. Kaelin finally turned his head. He looked at her face. He looked past the gray powder, past the severe hair, past the terrible dress. He looked directly into her eyes. If you were truly a dullard, Kaelin said softly, you wouldn't be breathing in time with the music to minimize the rustle of your dress. You wouldn't have checked the exits when I sat down. And you certainly wouldn't have been reading a book on soil nitrogen when you thought you were alone. Aurora stopped breathing altogether. You are terrified of being married, Kaelin stated, piecing it together in real time. You look at the men in this room and see exactly what they are, predators, fools, and bankrupts looking for a purse. Aurora felt a cold sweat break out on her collarbones. He was cutting through 3 years of defenses in 3 minutes. So you decided to become poison, Kaelin said, a faint, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. Brilliant, really. If no one wants you, no one can own you. Please leave me alone, Aurora whispered. It wasn't the grating voice. It was her real voice, quiet, desperate, and remarkably clear. Kaelin's smile vanished. The sound of her true voice struck him harder than he anticipated. It was low and rich. I cannot do that, Miss Howling, he said, turning his attention back to the singing girl at the front of the room. Why? Aurora demanded quietly, her pulse hammering in her throat. Kaelin didn't look at her as he answered. Because I need a wife, and I have just realized you are the only woman in London who isn't trying to lie to me to get my title. I have been lying to you since you arrived, Aurora hissed. No, Kaelin corrected softly, you have been lying to them. With me, you just started telling the truth. He reached out, his large, calloused hand briefly covering her tightly clenched fists in her lap. The heat of his touch burned right through the stiff taffeta. The masquerade is over, Aurora. Tomorrow I'm calling on your father. The morning sun crawling across Aurora's bedroom floor felt like a countdown. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her stomach a tight, cold knot. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the hall struck 11. Precisely on the final chime, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed 3 times. It sounded like a judge's gavel. Aurora didn't run to the mirror. She didn't pinch her cheeks or smooth her hair. She simply sat, listening to the muffled, frantic voices of the household staff, followed by the heavy, measured tread of boots on the stairs leading to her father's study. Lord Howling was not a vicious man, but he was a weak one. He lived for the card tables, chasing a streak of luck that had abandoned him a decade ago. Aurora knew her father's ledgers better than he did. She knew the grocer hadn't been paid in 3 months. She knew the roof in their country estate was leaking into the drawing room. 20 minutes later, the study door opened. "Aurora!" her father called out. His voice was thin, vibrating with a manic, terrified energy. She walked down the hallway slowly. She didn't need the stiff bombazine gown or the tight shoes today. The dread in her marrow was enough to make her posture slump naturally. She entered the study. Her father was standing behind his desk, sweating profusely, a glass of sherry trembling in his hand. Callan Pendleton sat in the leather armchair by the fire. He looked entirely too large for the room. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored riding coat, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. He didn't stand when she entered. "My dear!" Lord Howling sputtered, his eyes darting frantically between Aurora and the Duke. "The most extraordinary news. His Grace has asked for your hand." Aurora looked at Kylan. He met her gaze with cool, dark eyes. "Father," Aurora said. Her true voice slipped out, steady, quiet, and sharp. "May I have a moment alone with His Grace?" Lord Howling blinked, startled by the tone. He looked at Kaelin, who gave a single brief nod. Yes, Yes, of course. Propriety and all that. I shall be in the parlor. He practically sprinted from the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Silence settled over the study, thick and suffocating. He owes you money, Aurora stated. It wasn't a question. Kalen reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded sheaf of promissory notes. He tossed them onto the low table between them. 3,000 pounds, acquired over the last 6 months from various gentlemen who were tired of waiting for him to pay. I bought the debt this morning. Aurora stared at the papers. You are blackmailing him. I am securing an asset, Kalen corrected flatly. Your father is a fool, Aurora. If I didn't buy this debt, Lord Carmichael would have, and Carmichael wouldn't have married you to settle it. He would have taken your family's Surrey estate and left you all in a debtor's prison. Aurora swallowed hard. The metallic taste of panic coated her tongue. She walked to the window, wrapping her arms around her ribs. Why me? You could have any woman in London. You could have Clara. She would give you a dozen heirs and never look at a ledger. Kalen let out a low, rough breath. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't want a porcelain doll, he said, his voice dropping an octave. My father married a porcelain doll. When the estate went bankrupt, she wept in her room for 5 years while the tenants starved. I spent my 20s in the mud, pulling coal out of the ground to save my family name. I don't want a woman who faints at the sight of dirt. He stood up. The sheer size of him altered the air pressure in the room. He closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. I watched you, Kalen continued. I watched you turn yourself into a pariah to protect your independence. I watched you endure physical pain, tight shoes, bound ribs, just to keep the vultures away. You have a spine made of iron, Aurora. You understand survival. Aurora looked up at him. His face was a mask of rugged, uncompromising angles. There was no romance in his eyes. There was only a terrifying, undeniable respect. I am offering you a partnership, Kalen said. He held up a hand, ticking off his terms on long, calloused fingers. First, you will have complete control over the domestic budgets of all my properties. No one will question your math. Second, your 30,000-pound dowry will be invested directly into the new drainage system for the northern mines. You will receive a 20% yield on the profits, deposited into an account solely in your name. Third, you will give me an heir. After that, my bedchambers are my own, and yours are yours. Aurora stared at him. It was the most unromantic, transactional, deeply pragmatic proposal in the history of England. It was exactly what she wanted. And my disguise? She asked softly. Kalen's mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. Keep it, drop it, I don't care. The less time the men of the Ton spend looking at my wife, the less time I have to spend shooting them in duels. Aurora looked at the promissory notes on the table. She looked at her father's empty sherry glass. Then, she looked at the Duke of Ashbourne. I want 25% of the mine yields, she said. Kalen's smile finally broke through, genuine and sharp. Done. We marry in 3 weeks. The announcement hit London society like a brick thrown through a stained glass window. Lady Halling took to her bed for 2 days, torn between hysterical joy that she was going to be the mother-in-law to a duke, and sheer, unadulterated confusion as to how her ugliest, most obstinate daughter had managed it. He must have a terrible secret, Lady Halling whispered to her maid, clutching a vial of smelling salts. Perhaps he is missing a limb, or he has a touch of madness. It is the only explanation. The Ton agreed. When Aurora and Kalen made their first public appearance as a betrothed couple at the Duke of Devonshire's ball, the silence that followed them was deafening. Aurora had not relented. In fact, out of sheer, stubborn spite, she had escalated. She wore a gown of heavy, stiff velvet in a shade of olive green that resembled pond scum. She had applied a stark layer of white powder to her face, leaving her lips entirely bare, making her look like a consumptive ghost. She slouched so deeply her chin nearly rested on her sternum, and she dragged her left foot with a rhythmic, painful scrape. Kalen walked beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in stark black. He looked like a panther escorting a diseased pigeon. "They are staring," Aurora muttered, her voice pitched in its grating nasal whine as they navigated the edge of the ballroom. "Let them," Kalen replied easily. He didn't shorten his stride, forcing Aurora to work harder to maintain her limp. "Lord Hemsley just bet 50 pounds that I lost my eyesight in a mining accident. I might take him up on it." Aurora nearly stumbled. She bit the inside of her cheek to kill a laugh. They reached a secluded alcove. Aurora immediately slumped against a marble pillar, letting out a heavy, rattling breath for dramatic effect. A group of young debutantes walked past, their fans raised to their faces, whispering furiously. "She looks like a gargoyle," one of them hissed loudly enough to be heard. Aurora felt a familiar, cold detachment. She was used to this. It was her armor. But Kalen shifted. He stepped smoothly in front of Aurora, blocking her from the girl's view entirely. His broad back was a solid wall of black broadcloth. He turned his head, fixing the group of debutantes with a stare so dark and aggressively cold that the girls physically recoiled. They scuttled away like frightened mice. Kalen turned back to Aurora. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. Instead, he reached out. His large hand flattened against the middle of her back, right over her spine. "Stand up, Aurora," he said quietly. His voice carried no mockery, only a firm, grounding weight. "If I stand up, they will see I am not a hunchback," she whispered back, staring at his cravat. "No one is looking at us," Kalen said. "They are all terrified. I'm going to challenge them to a duel. You have 3 minutes of privacy. Use it." His hand pressed slightly harder against her spine. The heat of his palms sank through the heavy velvet. Slowly, agonizingly, Aurora allowed her muscles to uncoil. She pushed her shoulders back. She lifted her chin. Her spine straightened, vertebra by vertebra, unlocking with a series of microscopic releases. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, genuine sigh as the agonizing cramp in her lower back dissipated. When she opened her eyes, she was looking Kalen directly in the face. She was taller than most women, and without her slouch, she didn't have to strain her neck to meet his gaze. Kalen looked at her. He mapped the sharp line of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the proud, defiant set of her mouth beneath the ghastly powder. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "Good." Kalen's hand dropped from her back. "The waltz is starting. If we do not dance, your mother will likely feign a heart attack, and I have no desire to carry her to a carriage." Aurora instantly began to collapse her shoulders. "Ah," Kalen caught her elbow. His grip was tight, inescapable. "Not the back. Keep the spine straight. But limp if you must," Kalen murmured, steering her forcefully toward the dance floor. "Squint all you like, but you are marrying a duke, Aurora. If you walk onto that floor looking like a beaten dog, it reflects poorly on my reputation. I am known as a ruthless bastard, not an abuser of women." He pulled her into the frame of the waltz. He was incredibly strong. As the music swelled, Aurora realized he was completely controlling her movements. Whenever she tried to drag her foot, he lifted her slightly by the waist, smoothly covering her manufactured clumsiness. To the room, it looked as though the Duke was heroically dragging his crippled bride through the steps. To Aurora, it felt like flying. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to think about how to move poorly. Kylan carried her weight. She looked up at him, her chest tight with something entirely foreign. It wasn't the cynical triumph of deception. It was the terrifying, grounding sensation of being seen, understood, and managed by an equal. "You are a menace, Your Grace," she whispered. Kylan spun her, the pond scum velvet snapping around their ankles. "I told you, Aurora, I am a pragmatist." They were married on a Tuesday. There were no flowers, no choir, and no sprawling breakfast. It was a special license, executed in a dusty chapel in Mayfair with only Lord and Lady Halling in attendance. Aurora's father looked relieved to be unburdened of his debts. Her mother wept into a lace handkerchief, still entirely baffled by the transaction. Aurora wore a severe gray traveling gown. She spoke her vows in her normal voice, clear, flat, and legally binding. Kalen's voice was a low rumble in the cold church. He slid a heavy gold band onto her finger. It was plain, devoid of jewels, and felt like a shackle. An hour later, they were in a massive black carriage bearing the ducal crest, rolling north toward Yorkshire. The journey was to take 5 days. For the first 4 hours, Aurora sat rigidly on her side of the velvet squabs. She kept her chin tucked, her shoulders rolled forward, and her knees tightly together. The gray dress was restrictive, but her shoes were the true agony. She had worn her tightest pair, anticipating a public departure. Now, her toes were screaming in the cramped leather. Callan sat opposite her. He hadn't spoken since they left London. He had opened a worn leather satchel, produced a thick ledger and a pencil, and had been doing complex mathematics for 100 miles. The carriage hit a vicious rut in the road. Aurora jolted, her foot slamming against the floorboard. A sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped her lips. Callan stopped writing. He didn't look up, but his pencil stilled on the paper. "Take them off," he said. Aurora froze. "I beg your pardon?" "The shoes, Aurora." Callan finally looked up. His dark eyes were impatient but not unkind. "We are in a wooden box doing 8 miles an hour. There's no one here to impress with your martyrdom. Take them off before you permanently damage your arches and I have to hire a physician." Aurora stared at him. The sheer practicality of the command chipped away at her stubbornness. Slowly, she reached down. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny, cruel buttons. When the leather finally gave way, the relief was so profound she nearly wept. She kicked the shoes under the opposite seat, wiggling her toes in her thick stockings. "Now the pins," Callan commanded, returning to his ledger. Aurora's hands flew to her head. "My hair's fine." "Your hair's pulled so tightly your left eyebrow is twitching," Callan noted, scribbling a number. "It's distracting." Aurora's face flushed beneath her ghastly makeup. With trembling fingers, she reached into the heavy, unbalanced knot at the nape of her neck. She pulled out the first pin, then the second. The heavy mass of dark hair tumbled down her back, unspooling in soft, kinked waves. The pressure at her temples instantly vanished. She rubbed her scalp, letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 years. Without the tight shoes, her knees relaxed. Without the severe hair, her neck softened. Without the gaze of society, her spine naturally found its alignment. She sat back against the cushions, dropping the slouch entirely. Callan flipped a page in his ledger. He glanced up. He didn't gasp. He didn't offer a flowery compliment about a swan emerging from an ugly duckling. He simply looked at the woman sitting across from him. A woman with strong features, intelligent eyes, and a posture that spoke of quiet, unyielding endurance. "Much better," he murmured, and went back to his math. Aurora looked out the window at the rolling green countryside. The tight, cynical knot in her chest, the one that had kept her alive in London, began to loosen, just a fraction. By the 4th day, the rain hit. It was a torrential, driving northern rain that turned the roads to thick soup. The temperature dropped sharply. Aurora had stopped applying the gray powder on day 2. Her natural complexion, pale but warm and clear, had returned. She spent her time reading the agricultural reports Callan handed her without comment. They existed in a quiet, functional rhythm. "We are crossing onto Ashbourne land," Callan announced on the afternoon of the 5th day. Aurora put down her report. She wiped the condensation from the glass and peered out. She had expected rolling green hills and a manicured park. She had expected the idealized pastoral beauty the poets wrote about. Instead, the landscape was brutal and magnificent. The hills were steep and jagged, covered in dark heather and wet stone. In the distance, massive black scaffolding rose against the gray sky, the coal mines that kept the dukedom afloat. The air smelled of rain, peat, and distant smoke. The carriage crested a hill, and the estate of Highcliffe came into view. It was a fortress. Built of dark gray stone, it crouched against the moors like a sleeping beast. It had no delicate colonnades, no expansive glass conservatories. It was built for endurance, for harsh winters, and for surviving the elements. Aurora stared at it. It was severe. It was unyielding. It was completely devoid of pretense. "It isn't Mayfair," Callan said quietly, watching her face. Aurora looked from the grim, towering fortress to the man sitting across from her. They were perfectly matched. Kalen didn't belong in ballrooms any more than Highcliffe did. "No," Aurora said, her voice rich and steady. "It looks real." Kalen's eyes locked onto hers. For the first time since she had met him, the hardened, pragmatic mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw, fierce approval. "Welcome home, Duchess," he said. Highcliffe did not welcome Aurora. It tolerated her. The estate staff, hardened by years of northern winters and the Duke's brutal austerity, looked upon their new mistress with thinly veiled skepticism. They expected a London doll. They expected weeping when the hot water ran out, which it frequently did. They expected demands for silk hangings and French chefs. Mrs. Gable, a housekeeper carved from the same gray granite as the castle walls, handed Aurora the household keys on her second morning. It felt less like a transfer of power and more like a dare. Aurora didn't flinch. She took the heavy iron ring. She didn't wear the pond scum velvet or the mustard bombazine. She wore a simple, unadorned dress of heavy dark blue wool, her hair braided and pinned securely out of her face. She walked with her spine perfectly straight. "The ledgers, Mrs. Gable," Aurora said, her voice dropping the nasal whine forever. It rang out in the drafty stone hallway, clear and commanding. "I want the household accounts for the last 5 years on my desk in the library in 10 minutes, and a pot of strong tea. No sugar. We cannot afford it." Mrs. Gable blinked. She looked at the Duchess's straight back, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and the complete absence of powder or artifice. "Yes, Your Grace." That morning, Aurora went to war. She sat in the library, wrapped in a thick shawl, and dissected the financial ruin of the Pendleton family. Kalen's father had bled the estate dry on gambling, bad investments, and mistresses. Kalen had stopped the bleeding, but his method was a tourniquet that was slowly killing the limb. He funneled every available penny into the coal mines, leaving the estate to rot. The servants were underpaid. The roof leaked in the west wing. The draft horses were eating substandard oats. Kalen walked into the library at dusk. He smelled of rain, leather, and sulfur. His boots left clumps of mud on the faded Persian rug. He stopped, staring at the massive mahogany desk. Aurora had commandeered it entirely. Stacks of paper were sorted into precise, ruthlessly organized piles. She had soot on her cheek from a poorly drawing fire, and her fingers were stained with black ink. She looked exhausted. She looked entirely in her element. "You are sitting in my chair," Kalen pointed out. "You are not using it," Aurora replied, not looking up from a butcher's invoice. "And your filing system is a disgrace. You have the grain receipts mixed with the masonry bills. It's a miracle you haven't been robbed blind by the merchants in York." Kalen slowly unbuttoned his heavy coat. He didn't order her out. He dragged a smaller chair to the opposite side of the desk and sat down, stretching his long legs out. He watched her. "I assumed you would spend your first week redecorating the drawing room," he said quietly. "The drawing room doesn't generate a profit," Aurora countered. She finally looked up, tapping her pen against the ledger. "The drainage system in the lower mine shaft does. I transferred £300 from the winter entertainment budget to expedite the purchase of the new steam pump you wrote about in your notes." Kylan went perfectly still. "You read my engineering notes?" "I read everything." Aurora leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no shrinking, no slouching. She met him as an absolute equal. "You are bleeding the domestic side of this estate to death, Kalen. You're trying to do it all yourself, and you are starving your own people to feed the mines. I have reallocated the funds. The servants will receive a 10% increase in wages starting tomorrow. It will cost us £50 a year. They will work twice as hard, and they will stop stealing the candle wax to supplement their income, which will save us £60 a year. Net profit, £10. She pushed a newly drawn ledger across the desk toward him. "Review it. If you find a flaw in my mathematics, I will move to the drawing room and learn to knit." Kalen stared at the page. His eyes scanned the columns. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and ruthlessly precise. She hadn't just balanced the budget. She had optimized it. She had found money he didn't know he had. He looked up from the ledger, his gaze heavy and unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with the smell of old paper and rain. "My father's wife," Kylan said, his voice a low gravel, "spent 300 pounds on a single dress while the miners were eating boiled shoe leather. She didn't know what a steam pump was." "I'm not your father's wife," Aurora said flatly. Kalen's mouth twitched. The fierce, terrifying spark of approval returned to his eyes, burning brighter than before. "No, you certainly are not." He reached across the desk, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "Keep the chair," he said. From that evening on, they worked together. The sprawling library became the center of their strange, functional marriage. They sat across from each other for hours in companionable silence, accompanied only by the scratch of nibs on paper and the crackle of the hearth. They didn't speak of London. They didn't speak of romance. They spoke of crop yields, coal seams, and timber exports. And slowly, invisibly, the frozen earth of Highcliffe began to thaw. The staff noticed the change first. The Duchess didn't demand the impossible, but she demanded competence. She knew the names of the scullery maids. She knew the price of flour better than the cook. When Mrs. Gable fell ill with a fever, Aurora didn't summon a doctor from York. She sat in the housekeeper's cramped quarters and spooned broth into the old woman's mouth herself. The invisible armor Aurora had worn for 3 years finally shattered, not from a blow, but from lack of use. She didn't need to be ugly here. She just needed to be strong. And Kalan watched her. He watched her argue with the farrier in the courtyard, her cheeks flushed with the cold wind. He watched her pace the library, muttering about iron prices. He watched her, and the tight, paranoid knot in his own chest, the fear that he would end up ruined and alone like his father, began to unravel. He had married a business partner. He was beginning to realize he had brought home a queen. November arrived with teeth. The wind tore across the moors, carrying sleet that felt like shattered glass. Inside Highcliffe, the fires roared, but the chill seeped through the stones, settling into the bones. Aurora was in the library verifying the quarterly profits from the timber mill when the heavy oak door slammed open. Kalan stood in the frame. He was covered in mud from his boots to his thighs. His face was pale beneath a layer of soot, and his chest heaved as if he had run all the way from the valley. "The lower seam," he said. His voice was completely stripped of its usual calm. "The retaining wall on the east face gave way. The river is flooding the shaft." Aurora was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The ledgers hit the floor. "Are there men trapped?" "No." The shift was changing. They got out. Kylan dragged a shaking hand through his wet hair. "But the water's rising fast. If it breaches the main support pillars, the entire eastern tunnel will collapse. We'll lose a year of work. The estate will default on the bank loans." It was the ruin he had fought his entire life to avoid, staring him in the face. "Dawson is rallying the men," Kylan continued, turning back toward the hall. "We have to build a secondary dam inside the tunnel to divert the flow before it hits the supports. I'll be gone through the night." "Wait." Aurora ran past him, taking the stairs 2 at a time. She didn't ring for her maid. She tore off her wool dress, leaving it in a heap on the floor. She pulled on a thick woolen shirt, her heaviest riding habit, and a pair of Kalen's discarded leather work gloves that swallowed her hands. She shoved her feet into a pair of sturdy, flat-heeled boots. When she reached the courtyard, Kalen was already mounted on his massive black gelding, shouting orders to the stable master. A stable boy was leading Aurora's mare out. Kalen looked down, his expression hardening. "Go back inside, Aurora. This isn't a ledger. It's a flood. The mud is 3 feet deep and freezing." "Shash." "The dam you need to build requires timber," Aurora yelled over the howling wind. She swung up into her saddle, ignoring the side saddle stirrup and throwing her leg over the horse's back like a man. "You don't have enough seasoned wood at the mine to build a brace that size. But I just signed the inventory for the lumber mill. There are 40 reinforced beams sitting in the lower yard, 2 miles from the shaft." Kalen stared at her, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "You go to the mine and organize the men," Aurora ordered, her voice cutting through the storm with absolute authority. I will ride to the mill, commandeer the wagons, and bring you the timber. Move, Kalin." For a fraction of a second, the Duke of Ashbourne looked utterly stunned. Then, a fierce, feral grin broke across his face. He spurred his horse hard, plunging into the storm. Aurora followed. The ride to the mill was a nightmare of freezing rain and treacherous footing. Aurora didn't feel the cold. Her mind was a machine, calculating weights, distances, and wagon capacities. When she arrived at the mill, the foreman tried to argue. Aurora didn't negotiate. She invoked the Duke's name, threatened the man with immediate dismissal, and stood in the freezing mud organizing the loading of the heavy beams herself. 2 hours later, she rode into the mining camp. It was a vision of hell. Black water surged around the entrance of the shaft. Men were screaming over the roar of the flood, their faces smeared with coal dust and terror. Callan was waist-deep in the freezing water at the mouth of the tunnel, fighting to anchor a temporary brace against the surging current. He looked up as the wagons rolled into the muddy yard. He saw Aurora. She was soaked to the skin. Her heavy coat was caked in black mud. Her hair had escaped its pins, whipping wildly in the wind. She leaped from her horse, grabbed the lead line of the first draft horse, and dragged the wagon of timber directly to the edge of the water. "Unload it!" she screamed at the terrified mill workers. "Get it to him now!" Kylan didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The timber arrived right as the temporary brace began to splinter. For the next 6 hours, Aurora didn't leave the riverbank. She stood in the freezing sleet, directing the teams, passing ropes, and organizing the exhausted miners into relay lines. She was covered in soot, freezing and bruised. Just before dawn, the roaring of the water changed pitch. It softened into a steady gurgle. The secondary dam held. The main pillars were safe. A collective ragged cheer went up from the miners. Callan waded out of the black water. He looked like a corpse. His lips were blue, his hands bleeding and raw. He staggered slightly as he hit solid ground. Aurora caught him. She threw her own relatively dry riding cloak over his freezing shoulders. Her hands gripped the lapels of his ruined coat, holding him upright. Callan looked down at her. The rain washed the soot from his eyes. He looked at her mud-streaked face, her tangled hair, and the fierce, unyielding strength in her grip. There was no ugliness. There was only a profound, breathtaking beauty born of competence and sheer will. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I am your partner, Callan," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and cold. "I don't run from a bad ledger, and I don't run from the mud. Let's go home." The ride back to Highcliffe was silent. The storm broke, leaving a bruised gray morning in its wake. They staggered into the library. The fire was roaring, thanks to Mrs. Gable, who was waiting with hot water, brandy, and dry blankets. "Leave us," Callan croaked to the housekeeper. The door clicked shut. Callan dropped his ruined coat onto the floor. He poured 2 massive glasses of brandy, his hands shaking so violently the crystal clinked against the decanter. He handed one to Aurora. She took it, shivering uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered against the rim of the glass. Callan didn't drink his. He set it down. He stepped into her space, his massive frame blocking the heat of the fire. He reached out and took the glass from her trembling hands, setting it on the desk. Then, he took her freezing hands in his. His skin was rough, scraped, and blistered from the ropes, but the heat radiating from him was intense. He rubbed her hands briskly, trying to force the blood back into her frozen fingers. Aurora looked up. The physical proximity was overwhelming. The boundary they had carefully maintained, the sterile, transactional distance of their contract, was gone, washed away in the black water of the mine. Callan stopped rubbing her hands. His grip shifted, his thumbs resting against her inner wrists. He could feel her pulse racing. He stepped closer. His chest brushed against hers. "When I was in the water," Callan said, his voice low, vibrating in the quiet room. "When the brace cracked, I thought about the estate. I thought about the debt." He lifted one hand, his rough thumb tracing the line of her muddy jaw, wiping away a smear of soot. "And then I looked up and I saw you dragging a draft horse through the mud. His eyes darkened, the exhaustion eclipsed by something far more dangerous. And I realized I didn't give a damn about the coal. I was just terrified you would freeze. Aurora's breath hitched. She didn't step back. She stepped in, closing the final inch between them. You agreed to separate bedchambers, she whispered, her voice rough. Kalen's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. I lied. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of brandy, rain, and survival. It was a collision of two people who had spent their entire lives building walls, only to realize they were locked inside the same fortress. Aurora's hands fist in his wet shirt, pulling him down, kissing him back with a fierce, cynical passion that demanded nothing but the truth. When they finally broke apart, the air in the library felt heavy and charged. Kalen rested his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. Clause 3 of our arrangement is officially void, Duchess. Aurora let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. I will update the ledger in the morning. Spring came to Yorkshire not with a whisper, but with a sudden, violent burst of green. The heather bloomed, the rivers ran clear, and the Highcliffe ledgers, under Aurora's ruthless stewardship, showed a staggering profit for the first quarter. The estate was safe. The marriage, however, was about to be tested by the one thing worse than a flooded mine. London society. A letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lord Carmichael, accompanied by Lord Hemsley and a contingent of minor aristocrats, was traveling north to inspect a potential textile mill investment. They requested the honor of imposing upon Highcliffe's hospitality for 2 nights. Spies, Kalen growled, throwing the letter into the library fire. They want to see if the rumors are true. They want to see if the great Duke of Ashbourne is living in poverty with his gargoyle bride. Aurora watched the parchment curl and turn to ash. She felt a cold, familiar phantom weight on her shoulders, the instinct to slouch, to hide, to become the wallpaper. It was a reflex carved deep into her bones by 3 years of survival. She looked at her hands. There was a small callus on her middle finger from her pen, and a faint scar on her palm from a splinter she caught at the timber mill. These hands had saved a mine. They didn't belong in tight, punishing gloves. Let them come, Aurora said quietly. Kalen turned to look at her. His eyes were sharp. Aurora, you do not have to endure them. I can send a rider to turn them away at the county line. No. Aurora stood up. She walked around the desk and placed her hands flat against Kalen's chest. She felt the steady, strong beat of his heart. Highcliffe is not a debtor's prison, Kalen, and I am not a gargoyle. Let them come. Let them see exactly who you married. 2 days later, the London carriages rolled into the bleak, imposing courtyard of Highcliffe. Lord Carmichael stepped out, wrapping his velvet cloak tight against the northern wind, looking around the heavy stone walls with a sneer of performative pity. Lord Hemsley followed, shivering and complaining loudly about the state of the roads. They expected Kalen to greet them in the mud. They expected his wife to be hiding in a corner, draped in a hideous gown, confirming every nasty rumor that had circulated through Mayfair over the winter. Kalen stood at the top of the stone steps, dressed in stark, immaculate black. He looked massive, dangerous, and entirely unbothered by their presence. Carmichael. Hemsley, Kalen said, his voice carrying like a gunshot over the wind. He didn't offer a bow. My house is yours. The lords ascended the stairs, their smiles tight and patronizing. Ashbourne, my dear fellow, Carmichael said smoothly. So good of you to take us in. One hears such grim tales of the North. We worried for your health, and of course, for the constitution of your lovely bride. Is the Duchess well? We trust the northern air hasn't entirely broken her spirit. It was a veiled, vicious insult. He was asking if she was still ugly, still cowed, still pathetic. Kalen didn't tense. He didn't rise to the bait. A slow, lethal smile spread across his face. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the great hall. You may ask her yourself, Kalen said. The doors swung open. Aurora stood at the far end of the hall, framed by the massive stone fireplace. Carmichael stopped dead in his tracks. Hemsley actually choked on a breath. There was no mustard bombazine. There was no pond scum velvet. Aurora wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk that moved like water. It was tailored fiercely to her frame, highlighting the strong, straight line of her spine and the elegant curve of her waist. Her dark hair was swept up into a crown of braids, leaving her long neck bare and proud. She wore no powder. Her skin was flushed with health, her dark eyes sharp and utterly devoid of fear. She did not slouch. She did not squint. She radiated power. She looked like a queen waiting to judge peasants. "Lord Carmichael," Aurora said. Her true voice, rich, melodic, and cold as ice, echoed through the hall. "How brave of you to venture past the paved roads of Mayfair. I trust the mud did not ruin your delicate boots." Carmichael stared, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked at Kaelin, then back at Aurora, his mind fracturing as it tried to reconcile the crippled, repulsive spinster of London with the magnificent, terrifying woman standing before him. Your Grace," Carmichael stammered, bowing so deeply he nearly lost his balance. "You look, entirely well." I thrive in the cold, my lord," Aurora replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. She moved forward. There was no limp. She walked with a fluid, predatory grace that made Hemsley physically take a step backward. Dinner that evening was an execution masquerading as a meal. The London lords attempted to patronize Kaelin regarding his mining investments, implying he was merely a laborer with a title. Aurora dismantled them. She casually quoted global iron ore yields, dissected the flaws in Carmichael's own textile investments, and corrected Hemsley's mathematics on shipping tariffs so brutally that the man fell silent and stared at his mutton for the rest of the course. She didn't just defend her husband. She guarded his territory with a brilliant, vicious intellect that left the London men bleeding on the floor without a single sword being drawn. Kaelin sat at the head of the table, sipping his wine, watching his wife eviscerate his enemies. He looked like a man who had just won the world. By the time breakfast rolled around the next morning, the London contingent had ordered their carriages packed. They fled Highcliffe as if the plague had broken out in the West Wing. Kaelin and Aurora stood on the stone steps, watching the carriages disappear over the moors. The wind whipped Aurora's skirts around her ankles. She let out a long, slow breath. The ghost of London, the phantom weight of her disguise, was finally, permanently gone. Kaelin stepped behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his broad chest. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You are a terrifying creature," he murmured against her skin. Aurora leaned into his warmth, a genuine, relaxed smile touching her lips. "I told you, Kaelin, I am a tactician." "You lied to all of them for 3 years," Kaelin said, his hands tightening possessively around her. "You made them think you were a fool and a gargoyle. You fooled the entire aristocracy of England." Aurora turned her head, catching his eye. "But I didn't fool you." Kaelin looked down at her, the rugged angles of his face softening into something profound, permanent, and fiercely devoted. He had bought a wife to save his estate, but he had found a partner who saved his life. "No," Kaelin said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You never fooled me, Aurora. I always knew exactly what you were worth." He turned her in his arms, the heavy stone walls of Highcliffe rising around them, an impenetrable fortress built by their own 2 hands. "Everything," he whispered, and kissed her until the cold northern wind disappeared entirely. Aurora proved that true power doesn't come from fitting into society's mold. It comes from having the intellect to break it and the courage to build something real in its place. She went from the ugliest girl in London to the most powerful duchess in the north and found a love built on absolute respect. If you loved watching Aurora and Kaelin conquer their enemies and each other, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with a fellow romance lover. Drop a comment. What was your favorite moment of Aurora's revenge? See you next time.